Well, it was certainly identity politics has accelerated things, where the walls between groups. One time there wasn't so much walls between groups. It was just, okay, we recognise that, there's some minor differences here, but the commonalities still far outweigh the differences. But then the walls started going up with identity politics, the age of specialisation, and also people were able to carve out a nice niche for themselves. The more they pushed the view that Aboriginal people are so separate and different to everyone else, it gave them some status.
Welcome to Macquarie University Liberal Club Sunday Sessions podcast, live from the Facebook main page. My name is Andrew Kremen, and I'm joined with Lachlan Burke.
Good to be with you.
It's good to be with you as well. The Ullaroos Statement from the Heart has called for an indigenous voice to Parliament to be enshrined into the Constitution. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese is pushing ahead on a referendum to the Australian public. But the debate has already turned sour. Firstly, did it need to? And secondly, is the voice to Parliament a sound successor to the reconciliation? Today, we welcome back Anthony Dillon, researcher at the Institute of Positive Psychology and Education at the Australian Catholic University. Anthony was our first guest of the year, and we're lucky that he took the time out of his day to speak with us. Anthony, welcome back.
Hi.
As always, you can pose your questions to Anthony in the comments section, and we'll try to get to as many of them throughout the hour. So firstly, how did the voice to Parliament come about?
Look, I've just written about this recently in I'll give a quick plug. There's a book coming out by Connor Court soon, be towards the end of the year in the next few months. And it was a good opportunity for me to get my thoughts together. I'd written a few newspaper articles on it, but one thing that come clear to me as I was writing this chapter was I saw that the voice was basically the latest manifestation of this beast called self-determination, which has characterised Aboriginal affairs for many years. And, you might be thinking, well, isn't self-determination a good thing? Yes and no. I'll get to that in a minute. So how did it come about? I think it's just the latest manifestation of the self-determination movement. And if the voice falls over, there'll be something else to take its place, something else that will emerge soon. So to answer your question, how did it come about? Because we've always had this push for self-determination in Aboriginal affairs, Aboriginal people taking care of Aboriginal affairs sort of thing, like ATSIC sort of thing. So does that answer your question?
Well, could you go a little bit further into what you mean by self-determination movement?
What do I mean by?
But by the self-determination movement.
Yeah, most people have a rough idea of what self-determination means. It means doing things for yourself or deciding things for yourself. And that's great at the level of the individual. But when it comes to applying it collectively to a group of people, that's where I think the term falls down. So within Aboriginal affairs, it has come to mean Aboriginal people taking care of Aboriginal business, which essentially translates to Aboriginal people accessing Aboriginal services, that everything that gets done for them should be done by an Aboriginal person, Aboriginal people should make decisions for them, and that sort of thing. And that's fine when you have a close-knit, homogenous group, which isn't the Aboriginal people or any other group of people in Australia that I know of. And if you think about it, you probably wouldn't like someone who was chosen to make decisions on your behalf because they had the same surname as you. Okay?
Right.
Or even if it was someone in your family, because, within your family, it's very, very diverse. You have different political views, you have different ideas on how the world operates. You all have the same needs, but those needs are met to varying degrees. And, one part of the family might have a need for housing, another part of the family might have a need for a better library in their community or whatever. So, you're very heterogeneous. And so it is with Aboriginal people. It's, I just don't think the term self-determination can be applied collectively to anyone with any degree of success. So, I'm all for individuals taking care of their own needs or, initiating help and that sort of thing. And in this book chapter I've written, I've spoken about if I go to the gym, I may have I may have a personal trainer with a different cultural background to me, but it's still self-determination because I'm the one who has decided to go to the gym and do something about my health. Does that make sense?
Yes,
Yeah.
Plenty of world-class athletes tend to have coaches from other countries.
Yeah, and here in Australia, I see a physiotherapist from Korea. I see a doctor from India and other. I don't care where they're from. The self-determination part has been me initiating action to get help. But within Aboriginal affairs, we've said, oh no, it should be Aboriginal people seeking help from other Aboriginal people. And that's nonsense. And that essentially boils down to this other beast I call separatism. A group trying to keep themselves separate from other people, which, can't succeed. So the voice, in one form or another, the idea of it has been around for a while. This just seems, in the term of the self-determination doctrine, mantra, and the voice is just the latest manifestation of it.
My question, Anthony, is: do you believe that if there were a voice to Parliament, that this would lead to Australia Day the date being changed, or the holiday being cancelled?
I think it would certainly move towards that. That'd be one of the things. They would at least make the recommendation and say, this is what the people are telling us. This is what needs to be done.
So, in regard to the voice to Parliament, is it an advisory body, a legislative body? Do we fully understand what form it would take?
No, look, that detail seems to be missing, or if it is there, it's not very clear. But it does seem, in name at least anyway, at this stage, to be an advisory committee. And I don't have a problem with having, an individual or even a body giving advice on Aboriginal affairs. We've already got enough of them. We've got plenty of them already. But one concern I have is if you are going to have some sort of advisory body to help one group, in order to be an effective advisor, you don't have to necessarily belong to that cultural group. And that's probably, the biggest problem I have with any of these sorts of things. There just seems to be this underlying assumption that only members of a cultural group can understand that cultural group, which especially when it comes to Aboriginal affairs, Aboriginal people, I think is just absolute nonsense.
And does it concern you that that we haven't been given information about what kind of a body this would be, and why do you think that the details haven't been shared with us prior to the possible referendum?
Yes, it does concern me. Why it hasn't been shared, I don't know. Maybe they just don't quite know. Maybe they're busy dotting the I's and crossing the T's. Maybe there's a bit of conflict, disagreement among the architects of the voice, and that's fine. A little bit of disagreement is fine. That's the only reason I can think of. Maybe they're afraid to release it too early because people might have time to study it and think about it. Perhaps they're wanting to leave it closer towards the date of a referendum, so that people don't have time to consider the detail. I'm only speculating there.
it almost sounds like a federal election, and
Mm.
that the major details are presented in the last 48 hours.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. Um,
Gosh, and it's meant to be a change to our constitution. If there's one thing I can note, a concern is that the constitutional change could render, because one of the things is the Uluru Statement emphasizes the original tribes as sovereign nations,
Yeah.
and so with that, it's seen as coexisting with the crown. So there's the concern that this potential change could render either the creation of the colonies or the Federation of Australia as illegal.
Mm.
Do you believe that this concern is well founded?
Look, I'm not a legal eagle, but it certainly sounds like could be. And, but just the whole idea of certainly the Indigenous people in the cities that are all for it, and, the architects of it, they may like to say they're a separate nation or they're this nation. They may like to say, well, my sovereignty was never said, whatever the hell that means. But, they're just basic Aussies, the same as you and I, kind of thing.
If I can mention something that because it comes up in various topics, the disconnect between sort of the city folk and either those living in the country or those living in, say, disadvantaged communities. As you mentioned, there's the constant emphasis on the lived experience, and yet what this voice is meant to supposedly, the people that they're meant to help the most, those who feel dispossessed, they're the ones who are not they're not the decision makers.
Yeah.
In formulating this, like why has this been the case? And it seems to have been the case not only here but within the public debate for quite a while.
Absolutely, because there's this rule, sometimes written, sometimes unwritten, of you're either Aboriginal or you're not. There's, this dichotomy. And if you are Aboriginal, well, you're Aboriginal whether one of your 16 great-great-grandparents, I don't know if I got that right, what we have, 4 grandparents, 8 great-parents, 16 great-great-parents, I think. You know what I mean? They just say, well, you're Aboriginal if one of your 16 great-great-grandparents is Aboriginal, and you're Aboriginal if 16 of your 16 you're just all Aboriginal if you've got some ancestry. So therefore, we're homogenous, we're all alike. And being Aboriginal means that you can speak on behalf of on behalf of Aboriginal, which is just nonsense. You may be able to, having Aboriginal ancestry does not necessarily preclude you from understanding the people and speaking on behalf of them, but just that alone does not give you any innate knowledge, special knowledge to, know what the Aboriginal people need or think. There are plenty of non-Indigenous people who have lots of insight into what's happening with Aboriginal Australians because they've taken the time to understand. They haven't just, split everything up in terms of culture. They understand the whole person.
Almost like, someone, perhaps myself of Irish descent, as half my descent, I wouldn't be able to fully speak on, really on behalf of Irish issues for the simple fact that I haven't even studied them.
Yeah, exactly. And, a lot of these things that, we call Aboriginal or Aboriginal culture, you do have to investigate and learn. And it's not just a knowledge that's innate. And, they might like to tell us, well, we just have this natural connection with the land, et cetera, et cetera. Well, you can say that if you like, but I'm not convinced of it.
Do you think that's a spiritual claim? Because that is a part of the Uluru Statement.
Yeah. Well, it depends how you define spiritual, but yeah, it seems to be this. I just feel it in my heart. I just know it. When I hop onto this particular land, I feel something. And if people want to make that claim, that's fine. But it shouldn't be the basis of allocation of funding and decision making.
One of the claims on their website is that the Voice will only address issues that directly impact Indigenous Australians. But is there a concern that that's a pretty broad scope, that, you know, it could be argued that any range of issues impacts specifically Indigenous Australians? You know, there are some climate theorists who talk about climate justice and how climate change specifically affects minorities. So do you believe that's a concern, that the scope could be broadened beyond
Yes.
reason?
Yeah, that is a concern. It's, you know, quite open.
Well, if I could follow up on that, do you think, like, it's one thing to call that a broadened scope? Would you argue that that's the primary scope in a sense? It's the wider view, as opposed to dealing with the the proper issues that are being faced on the ground.
Sorry, can you restate that?
So we talked about climate change potentially being within the scope of as a primary Indigenous issue. Do you think rather that is, I suppose the political aim with that is the primary scope, as opposed to sort of this being the successor of reconciliation, or dealing with the proper issues that are on the ground?
Yeah, I still don't know if I fully understand the question.
Forgive me. So I'm asking whether, so with the example of climate change, rather than whether this is included in the scope, whether this is actually its primary scope.
Well, whether climate change is the primary scope?
Because yes, because I've noticed some similarities between some of the statements that are here and some of the statements that were made by Black Lives Matter.
Yeah. Look, I think the topics might change depending on what the fashion of the day is. You know, it's hard to tell.
Well, we've seen Lydia Thorpe in Parliament holding the Black Power salute, while calling a queen a colonizer in her attempted oath. Following the last question, do you believe the Voice will attempt to further sway the Republic referendum effort that the government is looking to present in a second term?
I think there's a possibility it will do that. You know, given that the Queen and England and all that has been portrayed as so evil and that sort of thing, and it kind of like might be their best bet, given that there's already independent of the Voice, already a movement in Australia to want to kind of detach from England. So I wouldn't be surprised if they were, if they did want to do that.
It seems that Jacinta Price, who is one of the most senior Indigenous political figures in the country, may not be part of the Voice to Parliament. Why do you think that is?
Oh, I think because she knows that, you know, like I've been saying for, you know, about 25 years now, Aboriginal people are people first. They're Australians. They are not this separate group with separate needs. Okay, certainly there are some differences in lifestyle for some of them, depending on where they live. But to sort of apply this blanket statement that Aboriginal people are vastly different to non-Aboriginal people is ridiculous, and Jacinta knows that. So she sees Aboriginal people as people first as well.
So, well, then why has this not been the primary view? I know throughout the various debates that we've had, possibly for the past 10 years, or also sort of presented by businesses. Like I've got a background in theatre, and there's constant statements at the start of a show, sort of always was, always will be Aboriginal territory.
Look, I'm not a fan of that, as you would have guessed. But if they want to do that, that's fine. You just go with it, because at the end of the day, it doesn't require me or us to do anything different. We just sit there. Okay, I'll put up with that mumbo jumbo for 10 seconds. That's fine. I'm not a fan of it, but let them play with their bone. Yeah.
Well, I suppose sort of following from that, how is it that the discourse has been so warped?
In terms of being seen as a separate entity.
Yes, and
Yeah.
not being seen as Australians first, but also where you essentially have virtue signaling taking the place of full charitable work, and seen as virtuous in the public eye, and for companies to sort of copy and emulate, as opposed to what you would generally expect from what you would expect when it comes to helping people in need.
Yeah. Well, it was certainly identity politics has accelerated things, where the walls between groups. One time there wasn't so much walls between groups. It was just, okay, we recognise that there's some minor differences here, but the commonality is still far out. Well, it was certainly identity politics has accelerated things, where the walls between groups. One time there wasn't so much walls between groups. It was just, okay, we recognise that there's some minor differences here, but the commonality still far outweighed the differences. But then the walls started going up with identity politics, the age of specialisation, and also people were able to carve out a nice niche for themselves. The more they pushed the view that Aboriginal people are so separate and different to everyone else, it gave them some status, who have a vested interest in keeping the differences going. Now, at this stage, I should just make a qualifying statement. I'm not opposed to businesses and organisations that are run by Indigenous people for Indigenous people. That's great to have them, but to make them kind of mandatory or the preferred or the only successful approach for servicing Indigenous people is ridiculous. Many of them are good. They're competent and they just attend to the business at hand, but it shouldn't ever be made as mandatory, and anything that's not Indigenous is seen as inferior or second rate or a violation of cultural safety, whatever that means.
What would you prefer to see happen rather than a voice to Parliament? I know you've sort of spoken in opposition to self-determination. Do you think we should sort of turn back the clock a bit or move forward with a different way of framing relationships between Aboriginal people and Australia?
Well, acknowledge the differences and have celebrations if you want, cultural weeks and NAIDOC or whatever, that's fine, keep that. But always keep reminding ourselves and the public that the commonalities far outweigh the differences, where we are Australians. Like I said, Aboriginal people are people first. Let's not forget that, and that Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people have the same fundamental needs, and that should be first and foremost, keeping that centre stage, and then respect, understand differences after that. So what would I have in place of the voice? All those existing bodies, and there's already different councils and units attached to government departments and that sort of thing. And that's fine. Keep them going, but they should never have the monopoly on Aboriginal affairs. They can provide input, so and that would be considered, along with other ideas and that sort of thing. So, that's first what comes to mind.
We saw Peter Fitzsimon's bully Jacinta Price in those text messages, claiming that she was empowering racists. Personally, I don't believe that. I don't believe that he is that dumb. There must be room for nuance when it comes to agreement or disagreement, not only in this but in any debate. Do you think claims of empowering racism will be employed against those who are capable of disagreeing well?
Yeah, look, it's already happened, and he, like many others, know that it's just such an easy way to shut down a debate or to put your opponent in a bad light. And of course, we saw this with Bill Leak 6 years ago. Once the mud of racism is thrown, it sticks. It's hard to remove. So, if you're struggling in a debate, if you're struggling to put forth a strong argument, like Peter obviously was, just play the race card, bring racism into it. Now, having said that too, I want to be clear, and I've thought this for a while, and I haven't had a chance to say it to a wide audience like I am now, but just as the pro-voice people are playing the race card and saying that, if you don't vote for it, you're a racist and you don't care for Aboriginal people, etc., I think there's a danger of the anti-voice camp doing it as well, playing the racism card. I've heard these claims already that it'll create two Australias, it's racism, blah, 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 blah. I think it's a bit of an exaggeration, simply because they draw on a definition which says, if race is a salient feature in a particular issue and you respond to that, that's racism. That's a pretty warped definition of racism. I prefer just the old-fashioned definition of racism of, it's assumed superiority over another race. And, I don't think that's happening. It's, it's just wrong assumptions that Aboriginal people all think alike and act alike. And some would call that racism. Not in the true sense of racism, it's not. It's poor thinking and it's damaging. I wouldn't go as far to call it racism. And I have a lot of buddies who do see it as, implementation of the voice would be racist, etc., and I hope they still respect me after this interview. I'm still on the same page as them. I don't think it's helpful to Aboriginal people, but I don't think it's racism. And I'll just add one other thing. For those who shout racism the most in order to convince people to adopt their view, I think when you do that, you're in danger of losing quite a few people too. Because no one wants to think, oh, gee, if I do that, am I racist? They will get fed up with it very quickly.
I find when it comes to almost any issue today, that there's always the maxim cards like this is racism, this is sexism, this is homophobic, this is misogynistic. It seems like there's been a total collapse in discourse, and particularly when it comes to current issues. Have you noticed that in general?
That's been happening for a while. It's basically intellectual laziness, and it just requires not having to think about something. And you can also add to that, as that comes under the umbrella of intellectual laziness, is just this claim of, well, my lived experience tells me so, and you don't know what I've experienced, sort of thing. So I'm speaking from my experience, so it must be true, and any narrative that counters that is obviously wrong. It's just intellectual laziness. Non-Aboriginal people are quite entitled to and quite qualified to have opinions on Aboriginal affairs.
So however important the anecdote is, we're seeing the primacy of the anecdote.
Sorry, can you repeat that?
So however important an anecdote is, we're seeing the primacy of the anecdote.
Yeah. And, we should dig a bit deeper, think a bit more broadly.
At hand, and the people that it generally tend to represent, and I sort of separated. It's like I'm clearly talking about the issue and have zero disregard to the group involved. And every time I separated, made it clear that they were separate. I was the argument was essentially the opponents would bring the two back together. They would merge them into one, just not the argument that I made, and then attack me on those grounds. And this would be in front of many different people.
Yeah.
So how does one even deal with that?
Often, I think it might be good often to do these things in writing or have them recorded so people can go back, well, this is exactly what I said and I stand by it. Otherwise, things can be distorted and twisted.
If the yes side does win out in the referendum, what are some of the things that you would like to see coming out of that outcome? What do you think some of the positives could be?
if it does happen,
Yeah.
I would hope that people, well, I mean, people like Jacinta, I'm pretty sure, will still make, decide what should be the priority, which is safe communities, safe homes, free of violence, etc., etc. She's always going to keep that as number one, and I'll be standing there alongside her, yes. So if the voice does get up, let's accept it, and let's hold them accountable. These are the things that should be done first, not enforcing welcome to country and that sort of nonsense, but, basic human rights, safety, that sort of thing. That's what I would like to see. I would like to see them focus on the true problems.
Absolutely.
And I guess some sort of accountability too, so that if they're not doing that, it can be, they can be disciplined or the body abolished or whatever. And I've also said too, if it does get up, and if it did work, I'll be the first to say I was wrong. But if it doesn't work, I'd say, okay, let's get on with doing what we know works. So, for example, let's look at the architects of the voice. They're all successful people. What's worked for them? And we know what's worked for them, okay? A bit of luck, you're born into the right circumstance, or at least you've been able to get to the right location. And you've worked hard, you've got an education and that sort of thing. That's what works for most Australians. And many Aboriginal people have proven that, as indeed the main architects of the voice. And that's the ironic thing, I guess. The biggest advocates, architects of the voice, are all doing very well. And I've said many times I respect them. I don't always agree with them, but I respect them. They've done well. They know where their next meal is coming from. They live in a safe home and that sort of thing. I simply want all Aboriginal Australians to have the same opportunities they've got. And they've got it without the voice. So even though they're the ones cheerleading for the voice, they've got the success without the voice. I find that very interesting.
Well, can you tell us some of the arguments that are being used by those who are against the voice, and also point out some of the some of the arguments that, as you mentioned, have not been, or any further arguments that haven't been useful to the debate?
Okay, so the arguments against the voice?
Yes, so those that have been good, and further ones that have not been so good.
Yeah, okay, so the not so good one, just to recap, I don't think it's good to say, if the voices implement, that represents racism, blah, 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 blah. I think it's a bit alarmist. Other arguments against the voice, okay, well, just recapping again, my main argument is there's a fundamental flaw that Aboriginal people are this group that can be represented by other Aboriginal people. The other popular argument, which I disagree with, against the voice, and my buddies, I hope they'll still have respect for me after this, and we hear it all the time where they go, well, we've already got 11 voices, 11 Indigenous people in Parliament. Those 11 voices, they are there for all Australians. They're not just there for Indigenous Australians. So, I don't ever want to see this message reinforced that Indigenous people are best to look after Indigenous affairs. Does that make sense? In fact, I would like to see a reframing of the argument rather than seeing things in terms of, Aboriginal people are helping Aboriginal people here, and that's good. And, well, we've got this non-Aboriginal, or we've got this mainstream organisation, and they're doing things for Aboriginal people. And that's not so good because they should be Aboriginal people, blah, blah, blah. How about we've got Australians helping Australians? And yes, those Australians who need the help have a bit or a lot of Aboriginal ancestry. They still need the same type of help, though, and that help can still be provided by other Australians. So, yeah, the argument that, well, we've already got 11 people there, that's kind of feeding into the narrative that you've got to have that Aboriginal ancestry in order to understand Aboriginal people. Well, I think, well, just as those 11 Indigenous politicians are able to have an opinion on Indigenous affairs and perhaps do a lot of good work, they also are competent at understanding the needs of non-Aboriginal Australian citizens. Yes? They should be, yeah. And if that's the case, if those Aboriginal political leaders can understand and help non-Aboriginal citizens, well, then it's also the case that non-Aboriginal political leaders can also help and understand Aboriginal citizens. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah, it kind of goes both ways.
Mm.
So other arguments against the voice, I guess what I've already touched on, what accountability will there be in place? Or, and I've said this in this chapter coming up, we don't want it to be like, it would seem that the ABC is kind of untouchable. I mean, there's been a lot of criticism of it being a closed shop and not living up to their charter and that sort of thing. But that's the end of it. There's just criticism and that's it. It stops. Where's the accountability? Okay. So I'd like to know if first of all, if the Indigenous voice does do well, yeah, let's celebrate it. I said I'll be the first one to admit I'm wrong. Let's give it praise. But if it's not doing good, where's the accountability? Will we be able to disband it, abolish it without the fear of racism and all these accusations of disempowering Aboriginal people and that sort of thing? Other arguments against it, well, the main one we've already spoken about. We don't seem to know what it is, what it's going to be exactly. Although we've got people saying, well, it's coming, or some have said, well, it is clear when you read a 300-page document, etc., etc. Where's the plain English statement of what it will do? So that's another criticism, but certainly my dominant primary criticism is just this assumption that only Aboriginal people fully understand Aboriginal affairs, and therefore they are the best ones placed to deal with Aboriginal people.
We've
If I think of some more, I'll come back to it. But right now, that's my thinking.
No. Thank you for summing that up for us. We've got some audience questions here. Would there be a special provision where improvement of Aboriginal education and health be prioritised in the voice?
Well, I hope so. And that's right alongside of the immediate safety. And so when we think of the most pressing problems facing Aboriginal people, sure, we have people like Jacinta, and for obvious reasons, because she's nursed more battered bodies than I've had hot breakfasts. So it's obviously a personal issue. She's seen it. She knows it firsthand. So yes, we've got to take care of those in crisis situations where we've got to make absolutely certain they are being fed, they live in safe homes, safe communities, free of violence, etc., etc. But yes, we do have to also, that's the short term, but yes, long term, we do need to consider that Indigenous people have, especially those living in areas where they don't have access to good education, we've got to make sure that they have access to a quality education as well, and are given all the support they need, to overcome the challenges that go with living in remote areas and that sort of thing. So yeah, education along with employment opportunities, and that should be right up there with safety.
What is your view of the concept of reconciliation?
Oh, good question. It's one of those things that hasn't been defined that well. And I think perhaps intentional, unintentional, I don't know, because it hasn't been defined that well. You'll have some people always saying, well, we still need reconciliation. We haven't reached it yet. Well, how do we know if we haven't, or we haven't, if we haven't defined it properly? But to me, it means just getting along with each other. And we already have Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people doing that already. You know, there's high intermarriage rates, and you got Indigenous and non-Indigenous people living beside each other, working together, and all that sort of thing. And I suppose if we want to go one step further, perhaps reconciliation does mean getting all the problems fixed. Okay? If you want to define reconciliation as closing the gap and having things right, that's fine as well. But we should be able to say, you know, we are becoming more reconciled, and problems are shrinking, and that sort of thing. So I think that's what reconciliation means. So in the basic sense, getting along, working, coexisting, meshing together, and then secondary, fixing up the problems.
Well, we do have another audience question here. You mentioned accountability. To what extent do you think self-determination of internal affairs of the Aboriginal citizens can the non-Aboriginal citizens learn?
Can the what?
Can the non-Aboriginal citizens learn?
What can they learn from it?
Yes.
That we're all played by the same rule book. That, you know, just being Aboriginal doesn't mean you're exempt from accountability and that sort of thing. That you know, it's a business. It's, you know, it's part of our parliament, our political system. Whether or not, you know, as imperfect as what it is, there's a set of rules that we should all be playing by equally. You know, and if something's dysfunctional, it's not working, well, then it needs to be fixed or abolished. Yeah, then that's the same whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous. I hope I answered that question.
No, I think that was well done. I also have one final question. You said that you have an essay coming up in an upcoming book. What is the name of that book, so we can put it in the comments?
I don't know what the name of the book is, but I know that the public, and I'm sure they won't mind me saying it, Connor Court.
Yep, Connor Court Publishing. Yep.
Connor Court. And you know, it won't be out before September, but hopefully not too long after September. So October, November, definitely, hopefully by the end of the year. And there's a good list of names. I know that, again, I didn't. Jacinta's writing the forward to it. Oops, should I have said that? Oh, sorry, I've already said it, haven't I? Okay, yeah, so we can't erase that now. Sorry about that, but in case you didn't hear it the first time, Jacinta's writing the forward to that book. And there's a host of other good authors, all presenting good views. But I've already told you my view. It's basically self-determination and separatism, which has always been around for many decades. The Voice is just the latest manifestation of that, in my opinion.
Well, if it ends up if that's not something that you can tell us about who's writing the foreword, then maybe we can work out editing magic to get that out. Anthony Dillon, thank you so much for joining us again on Sunday Sessions. It's been a pleasure.
Oh, thank you.
This has been a Macquarie University Liberal Club production. My name is Andrew Clement, and I've been joined by Lachlan Burke. We will see you next week.